so that we can figure out how this would go. So basically what I'm looking at is of how the Jordan Pond House might factor in. They would be able, then I'm assuming as a private vendor, to be able to hook on with the Spectrum project probably much more easily than the National Park Service. Is that fair to assume?
Yeah, that is correct. So we have mechanisms for funding for that, and then we would just work with the national parks on the rest of it.
Yeah.
But we would fund it initially up front.
Yeah. You could probably go directly, pay into Spectrum directly on that, then I'm guessing.
Correct.
Yeah. So I think what we would need to do is determine which properties that are on Acadia National Park are going to be subject to this, whether it would be all of them or just one or two of them, and then we would want to delete from the Spectrum proposal any of those that wouldn't be covered. So then we would be able to get a price of what the total project is going to cost at that point, and then go from there. So I think that's a great progress. So I know Spectrum, I think the price that they had quoted us includes all of those properties within the Acadia National Park. So we might be able to knock that down a little bit if it were not going to include all of them and come up with within a new price. So that is somewhat encouraging, but that's kind of where we would stand at the moment, I think, is knowing which properties are and are not going to be covered, getting a revised price from Spectrum, then we know we've got the Mount Desert opera money. If we could get a final price, that then we could go to the select board with, and say we would like to request these monies to be used to finish these connections. Does that make sense, Brian?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So
I think I mentioned earlier that what we've got is like about 128,000 left out of the opera, which I'm assuming is probably Spectrum is going to like, especially if there's some properties that aren't going to be covered. So I can get the exact number, but I think it's like 128,300, something like that is what's left in our account.
yeah, as soon as you figure out what those properties are that won't be covered, let me know, and then we can get them to revise their proposal.
Yeah.
And do we know yet if the park and you, Brian, have connected on GPS location so we can identify which buildings, what use they have, et cetera? Kevin, do you know about that?
Yeah, I think I don't know if we've connected with Brian, but we can certainly identify those properties. And just to be clear, anything that John would be able to speak to or commit to would have to be part of his land assignment as a concessioner. So he's going to be kind of pigeonholed to the Jordan Pond House restaurant and potentially the dormitory, if that's something that Jordan Pond is interested in. So as a concessioner, they may have the ability to expend capital funds for their land assignment. So that's one of the things, Derlin is we've been talking about some of the frustration of not being able to find a mechanism for the park to work in totality with the town to consider a lot of these locations, but we may be able to consider this one at Jordan Pond House, which is critical. There is a critical need there. So
that would be a good workaround, Kevin.
Excuse me?
That would be a good workaround, I think.
It will at least allow us to get it to Jordan Pond.
Right.
And that would be a good start.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah.
So what we would do at that point then would be deleting those other properties from the proposal. Then we could get, finally, I think Spectrum could give us a final number. And then we would know that 2 of those buildings or whatever would be the concessionaire and the rest would be Town of Mount Desert. And we ought to be able then to put this thing all together, I would hope. Definitely.
Agreed.
And so that would mean that other properties that we have identified that are on park land would not be connected at this time as part of this project.
Right, the Park Service doesn't have any mechanism to provide financing to support those other locations.
So we would just have to let it go.
Yep.
Okay.
But we might, let's finalize everything else. And then see how much that is. For the Park Service locations that wouldn't be served as a percentage of the overall. We may be able to get Spectrum to negotiate a little bit here and maybe throw those in. So let's not give up on them. Let's not let them distract us either, but there may be an opportunity here to get them to do some more. So
That would be wonderful if that were the case. That would be
I
a
just-
collaborative effort with the park, so I'm
Yeah.
interested in doing those the best I can.
I don't want to give up on it
Right.
until we've exhausted everything.
Yeah.
So let's see how it goes.
Well, it's kind of been like a learning opportunity, I think, for us, to try to see how we navigate through this whole process. So it's good. Thank you, Brian.
So what would be the mechanism then? Are we going to have Brian approach Spectrum with that possibility to see how they might come up with a new figure for us to cover those without changing the cost at all?
So let's see how much we can come up with between the concession for Jordan Pond and the town and what else is left that isn't going to be covered. Once we see that, then I can approach Spectrum and say, all right, look, this was your original proposal. Here's how much we can do. Is that good enough to cover everything?
Yeah,
Yeah.
let me get, I'm gonna send an email right now over to my finance guy to get the exact total that we've got left in ARPA, but pretty sure it's gonna come out just about 128. So you hold on a second. Hopefully I'll get that fairly quickly.
I have a question. So in my process, how would I go about finding out what the total cost would be for our commitment?
So we need to just identify those locations and we'll go back to Spectrum and ask them what is the amount for just those locations, because we have different funding sources. We need to break that out.
Okay,
So but that won't be a huge heavy lift.
okay.
But I only want to go back to them once. In other words, we go back to them with those locations and the other locations that can't be served or can't be funded right now in the Park Service, and then we'll bring that to Spectrum, get your amount, and then see what we can do with everything else. So
Brian, do you have what you need in terms of the location information about which buildings we're talking about and which ones we're?
yeah, if you can give me addresses or yeah, addresses would be the best for Spectrum. Lacking that, just give me a GPS coordinate.
So should I email you those addresses?
Please.
What's the best email for you?
It's Brian with an I at cascobayadvisors.com.
And we are looking at this as a subtotal of the property list that Spectrum gave us some time ago. And we're carving off some of those. I mean, they had given us an uncabled address list and an unserved address list.
And so we're looking for 100% coverage for the town of Mount Desert.
Right.
And whatever that means. So they're gonna have to make a commitment that they're gonna cover 100%, minus those National Park Service locations potentially.
Mhm.
And being able to identify the Jordan Pond area as a separate carve out, then we'll be able to assemble all that.
And is it clear to you the other locations are either in Acadia boundaries or not? Is that something that you already know from your mapping?
Generally, from the mapping, to the extent that the boundaries of the Park Service are represented accurately within Google, then we know. But if the Park Service sends us that list, then we will have the definitive.
So would it be helpful if they gave you the list of addresses to exclude, not part of the Jordan Pond House concessions, but the other addresses, just for disambiguation?
Correct.
So who's the best person to provide that list to Brian?
Oh.
That's what we were just talking about with, so I think we have it covered.
So if you get the final price that we have from ARPA, the two locations that we're looking at for Jordan Pond House, and then a clarity on the list of things we are excluding, that should be enough information for you to go to Spectrum. Great.
I think as part of that list, what I recall of it, there are several locations in there that we would probably not bring broadband to, because there really is no infrastructure there to support it. So I would say that, I guess, as part of a subset of that list, Brian, we might identify those locations to say, hey, in the absence of, if some carving needs to be done, here are the key locations that we'd be interested. The rest of them, we are never, or at this point in time, we're not interested in.
Okay, that'd be great. So, denote them as such.
Okay.
Anything else on this topic?
We have a plan.
All right. All right, let's move on. Number 3, another update from Derlin regarding the Spectrum cost proposal and funding possibilities. Anything else to add here, Derlin?
And I think we've covered it already, so I think we know where we're going with that.
Great. And now we can hear from Brian about the consolidated proposal. Or
Yes.
maybe lack of.
So I had a conversation with them this morning. They shared that their cost to build out the entire island, the 4 towns, is 11.4 million. And they would be looking for the 4 towns to contribute 5.8 million, or 50% of that amount. I have been pleading with them to break that down by town. And they've had difficulty doing that. I think I straightened them out this morning, and I'm hopeful and optimistic that we're going to get a breakdown by town. Now that breakdown by town will have a condition on it, and that condition is that all towns have to go in.
Sure.
And if 3 towns said they didn't want to do it and 1 town did, then Consolidated would have to go back and come up with a different price, because they would be building potentially in a town that isn't interested in order to reach areas of a town that is. But so that's where we're at. And you should consider that none of those towns are going to be eligible for any grant funding of any significance. So when looking at it or thinking about the 5.8 million, that would be without any state or federal subsidies. Now, Hancock County, if they still have some ARPA funding that they were using for local grants, there's potential that they could help fund a portion of that. But my guess is it wouldn't be a huge portion of that 5.8 million.
Brian, did you hear of a date that they may just eventually come on their own?
They they don't share that kind of information. And I, if it were me and I was interested in pursuing that, I would counter that 5.8 million. I think 50% is a high number given the density that you have. And I would probably counter at half of that and see where we got. But I wouldn't, you're not in a position to even counter until you knew that you had the community taxpayer support for such an endeavor. And until CCI saw that you had that support, they're probably not going to seriously negotiate. Just because they have other priorities and don't have the time to negotiate. So you would really have to bring along a demonstration. Nonetheless, I think it's still important to get the price per town so that you have it as part of your due diligence. They are definitely building out a portion of Bar Harbor. They just haven't defined exactly what portion yet. So.
And this would include drops to every home, 100% coverage and drops basically.
Yeah, it would include the drops provided there was a path for the drop. The path being if it's aerial, there's existing utility poles, or if it's underground, there's a conduit available.
So they've said that the total cost for a island-wide build-out is 11 million. They're looking for about half of that, 5.8, as a contribution from the towns. We're hoping to get a breakdown by town, with the caveat that all towns would have to come in together to get that
Right.
price.
That's
not
11.4 million, not 11.
11.4 million. And they're not disclosing any sort of roadmap of when they may, on their own volition, come to the island.
Correct.
And you think that if we got community support and could prove that community support, we could potentially negotiate that number?
That's correct.
Would it be inappropriate to point out that half of 11.4 would be $5.7 million?
The 5.8 is actually 50.87%. I rounded.
Well, thank you for pestering them and getting some progress on that.
Well, I'm disappointed that we don't have more firm progress, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
I think it's useful to have that as here's a potential future state, a potential goal to reach if we can get consensus across the towns.
And I'll tell you, this total dollar figure, 11.4 million, is less than what was proposed as a possible expense to just for the town of Mount Desert back in 2015. So costs have come down, so that's a good thing.
Actually, costs have not come down. They have risen, but in 2015, was that a proposal from Consolidated?
It was not a proposal, no. It was Tilson Technologies came and did a study and said, you know, this is the kind of cost you could be looking at. And it was more like 15 to 16 million dollars.
Yeah, and that, keep in mind, you know, that was probably not really a well-defined cost back then, but that was also to build a new network, not with Consolidated.
Right.
Consolidated has the advantage that they're already on all of the utility poles.
Exactly, yeah.
So you can't really compare that on an apples to apples basis.
And Brian, what is Consolidated doing in Bar Harbor? Are they moving forward with the whole municipal system?
As part of the dark fiber negotiation between Bar Harbor and Consolidated to connect all of the town of Bar Harbor municipal locations together in the dark fiber network, as well as the town office in Mount Desert. Part of that negotiation included a commitment from Consolidated that they were going to build fiber to the home in Bar Harbor, but not to the entire town. And the negotiation did not include a definition of the portion that they would build and the portion that they wouldn't build. All that they got was a commitment that they were going to do something. And there is an area of Bar Harbor on the far western side that Consolidated has received funding from the FCC to build fiber to the home. It's a small area. And if you look at the Bar Harbor study that we did, we've identified that geography. So they have this already standing obligation to build out some, and they made a commitment to build more. They just didn't make a commitment as to where. So.
No, excuse me a second, Kathy. I just got to note that the Sustainability Committee, since this was a special meeting we booked in, has dibs on us for like at 4:30. So we really need to kind of wrap this up at this point, because we were sort of an interloper onto their time, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. We only have one other item in front of us, which is the Tremont Broadband Committee updates.
And there's nobody here from Tremont, so.
So any other questions for Brian, just because we kind of rushed the end of that one? Any other such discussion of next steps and other such business?
Yeah, I think we need to move on to digital equity planning.
Yeah, and just finalize the spectrum conversation with ANP and the town.
Yes.
So it sounds like we've got good clarity on that, and we can maybe bring up this CCI proposal to maybe an all towns meeting or something. We can talk about that maybe at the next meeting. What to
And
do.
if anybody has any questions for me in the interim, just feel free to reach out via email or phone. Happy to talk.
Thank you.
All right, I think that about does it.
Thank you.
All right,
See you
Stop
later.
recording. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you,
nice day.
guys.